Hallo.
Hello.
Vielen Dank für diesen sehr freundlichen und zahlreichen.
Thank you very much for this warm and loud applause. Pop and anti-pop, and how the internet taught us to fight and what for. This is a talk I will be holding in the next 4 hours. Not exactly 4 hours, but I have 1 hour. I will overdraw that. There's a word missing in the introduction on the Republica website. It said for and not against. It means, what I wanted to say is for and not only against. I wanted to do a talk about what I learned in the last year in the internet about populism and left and right extremes, and you could see my insecurity about the momentary observation, and this is a talk about how to enact what we learned back then into life. So the Republic has turned from an internet to a society conference, and you can get society in Europe only digitally nowadays, but it feels different than we thought. And about 10 years ago, if I'd explained about 10 years ago that a war could be declared via Twitter, you would have laughed at us. It's rightfully so. And there is very believable hints towards that the attack on Syria by the United States happened because Donald Trump wanted to live up to his own tweet. This is a terrible and wonderful example for the many insecurities of a more and more digital world order. We're not talking only about pop and anti-pop, with populism and anti-populism, but also how Europe will manage the digitalization. Maybe it's the largest problem of the continent, and you will see that I'm taking this very seriously. The largest problem of the continent is talked about as right-wing populism. The success of right-wing and extreme right-wing populism and ideologies. You can see these countries where right and right-wing, extreme right, where they in the parliament, in light blue, dark blue, where they are part of the government, and dark black, where they have taken over the government.
I believe that is not only a problem, but I believe that is the problem of today. Some people say that we have to meet the populism from the right with the populism from the left, and I believe that is one of the most ridiculous things heard in recent history. You could think that the cure against populism might be anti-populism, but an early work of a man that today is leading a populist right extremist party has a tendency to show that. Against anti-populism is a piece from Tagesspiegel, and the author is Alexander Gauland. In this article, you could have suspected it, which direction he would take, a grotesque idea of populism, which he says is the world of the folk. He says that it is the political debate, and he uses the usual phrases of good humans and political correctness and strengthening the extreme right and extreme left. Out of this piece from Gauland, you can take populism by surprise fighting it as with populism. You can learn a lot about him, but not about anti-populism. Regardless, I believe that populism shouldn't only be met with anti-populism. The Wiener philosopher Marchard in October 2017 said that a general critique against populism by itself is much too empty. Liberal anti-populism is an expression of post-politics. I would like, with Marchard, only to do half the way, but it is the decisive way. I believe that half of this is right. I think that there's no positive offering, and I have to, at this point, start talking about the we that I'm using in this context. The we you always have to explain, because otherwise old white wise men will come from the upper class like me, and everyone else are only supposed to be part of it. That's what we learned from the internet, are summarized in this we. The we that is in this title, the not right extremist civil society in Germany. That is the we that I'm talking about today. Because the counterpart to right extreme is not left extremist. The counterpart to right extremist is not right extremist. I have to admit that in the past few years, there was punctual excitement about this non-right extremist civil society in Germany. I mean, everybody can obviously see this in a very different way, but that Germany, about 1.5 million war refugees, and takes them in, and I think that's something that we can really see as a success if your expectations were set low. Above that, in 2016, a CDU General Secretary on Twitter identified a Nazi as such. To be more precise, a dirty Nazi, that's what he called him, with a beautiful dot in the end, with a beautiful full stop that is more like cultural heritage from the Mountain Castle Bridge in Dresden. By having this kind of CDU politician have something saying like this publicly, they must have lost anybody who thought this was should be taken for granted. If you look back to the 90s, under the politics of Kohl, the tightening of laws when it came to asylum seekers is what shaped those years, and that is something that you have to keep in mind and bear in mind thinking about looking at this tweet now. And if the 50s and the years of the economic boom in CDU and CSU said that the children of German mothers with who had kids with black US soldiers should be deported right after they graduated their high school degree, regardless of the fact that they had German mothers. The separation from the right and the right extreme is wearing down, because obviously these people were just making a pretty face to what was en vogue at the time. There was too little times and only under pressures when they would renounce this kind of political views. But apparently this doesn't seem enough. To be against something is highly valuable if you want to motivate the crowds. But to only be against something is not in any way, shape, or form a way to generate progress. In order to generate progress, you have to have a goal. The hate, I do not take this applause. The hate and the public denunciation against the other and foreigners is something against active participation in society. These people believe that their idea of society is positive, and it's just not for everyone. 1 year of dealing with the right and the right extreme in social media showed to me and proved to me that in the heads of people who have a tendency to take well to these ideas is the ideas like we solve your problems by protecting you from the other. And for a lot of people, this is a solution to the problems. And in a time of crisis and a lot of contact with the other, not the least with via social media, this is a very tempting offering. This is a very tempting offer. The racism, the homo and transphobia, the sexism, all of these to us seem like something against general humans, but the people who are receptive to this view this as a really simple solution. The difficult things about these simplified theses is that they're based on lies, but they have residues of understanding, and that is enough. Populism doesn't have to differentiate. It doesn't have to say the truth. It doesn't have to rely on the reality. It's about the feeling. Right and right extremists are so successful in social media because social media are medias that are led by emotions, like love, ha, 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 sad and angry. Social media is spheres of emotions, of felt emotion, felt truths, because everything is understood and watched by the glasses of emotions. And
Rechte und Rechtsextreme bieten in den Augen ihrer Klientel Lösungen.
It works, the right and the right wing.
Aktiver Mithilfe eines Teils der Massenmedien. Die bieten also scheinbare Lösungen,
Sorry.
die nicht rechtsextreme Zivilgesellschaft sind, bloß dagegen.
We're only against it and not the popular for everybody else. It's being against the right wing. It just they believe that it is just a generally anti sentiment against them. So.
And that's why Markert is right when he's pointing out a sort of emptiness behind these truths. And that's why I personally thought, how can I come from an against to a for, and these are the results. I fight for a society in which a Jewish, unemployed, lesbian, she-male, in a bikini, drunk, kissing, can be kissing in everywhere place with a breastfeeding black, handicapped ex-Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, dancing on the street without having to fear of having their existence to be taken from them, with Wi-Fi. In brackets, because we're at the digital conference. Nobody should be feeling excluded, because the picture that I'm painting here obviously also includes men. That is the little star on the side. Maybe at some point in the future we have to substitute Wi-Fi with 5G, and of course my goal doesn't have to become your goal, but this is my personal perspective of what a liberal democracy has to provide. And I have the opinion that us, who are not the right extremist civil society, this is where we have to build up the pressure, and we have to build up the pressure on the politics. By itself, it's not going to do that, or at least not as strong. The current Minister of Interior congratulated the current leader of the Hungarian who just won, Viktor Orban, who won by spreading anti-Semitic propaganda. And there's, in my opinion, only one way of doing liberal democracy, and I believe that Mr. Seehofer is one who takes well to illiberal, and we will see that when he introduces his monstrous Bavarian police laws and apply them to all of Germany. I believe that CSU is almost just about liberal democratic party, but I believe that they're kind of in the little kids pool where you don't have to know how to swim.
Maybe it's just late damages of the CSU belief that anything under absolute majority is state crisis. But the question we have to answer is how to strengthen the liberal democracy. We have to find out, in order to do that, we have to first find out how threatened it is. Close lying answer to that is exclusion is simple. And then I had a look at those people who are drawing to the right, and I looked at an example of the German media publicity, old men who are drifting to the right. They seem to be available in all colors if the color is white. Georg Seeslen wrote an essay on Get It Done about the movement from so many German intellectuals to the right. Gitlin offers a lot of explanations to that. The heroic, for example, about the heroicity of the penis as a political organ. He offers
the left establishment that you have to raise up against, and the economy of attention that right theses are addressed more than left. And I understand that, and all seems rather all right to me, but I would like to address a few things. Why are there so many old intellectuals that drift towards the right? On the one hand, I believe that the societal progress, that is what it is. It's the societal progress that's happening right now. I introduced to you how a CDU General Secretary calls somebody a dirty Nazi, and somebody that is a dirty Nazi. One of these old intellectual men is surprised why he's considered reactionary. He still had the same opinion that he had back in the days when he would be considered a left. In this sentence, there's so much non-knowledge. It makes you want to throw up, makes you want to cry, and all of it at the same time. But there is a fundamental not understanding of societal progress. Societal progress doesn't have a goal that you can achieve and then it's fine. Societal progress is a continuously going fight. It's a never-ending thing. It's not about making the structures better. It fights against egoism, narcissism, the love of violence, and those are endless. And that also means that if you stop believing in the necessity of this fight because you're tired and you don't have better explanations of why to stop, and you slowly start the process of the right uprising. And now women are allowed to vote, and one of them is a chancellor now. And right after that, you can have the second pattern of explanation, the ex-left classic, it's got to be enough now. I think that stems from the personal perspective of former left fighters and who fought and for many, many years, and then all of a sudden for the next generation it's not good enough anymore. And these people have they don't feel respected because every new fight against the structures express the unhappiness and the unsatisfaction of the things that others have fought for. And then there's a new generation that comes up after everything that you've done, and what's with Africa, and the garbage in the ocean, and #MeToo. And they become upset. And the third pattern of explanation for the move towards the right helped me understand the lines of conflict. It might sound a bit evil, but I believe that a lot of old intellectuals have an issue with losing influence and influence of interpretation in particular. They can feel they're sinking, they're formerly rising star going down, and this understanding but the world, and so that's why they think that the world is what's going down, and it's not them and their influence. John Barr published interesting studies in his book Before You Know It about the fear where physical harm or the threat of physical harm can make people more right. And on the other hand, there's also the thought that I'm sorry, I lost that thought. Social media triggers. After a day of focus online on Facebook, who doesn't become scared is somebody that I would think as socially disturbed. When the thesis is true that a certain move toward the right comes from the projection from the inside to the outer world, you understand an interesting parallelism of a very current book that can tell us a lot about today's, which is by Theodor Adorno, Studies on the Authoritarian Character. What he describes in this book is the traits of characters that make authoritarian patterns. And every quote from this book could be applied by a Trump article. The mentality of prejudiced individuals is characterized by a thinking of stark contrast between self and foreign groups. The main thing is that something has to be done. It doesn't matter what is done. It is telling about the fascist leader that he has a tendency to give wishy-washy explanations about his own person. And one of the central theses of this book is that the authoritarian character projects his inner conflicts onto the world. I can see a great parallelism between this and the move towards the right within the intellectuals' fear. And it seems that it's a lot less about a schema of right and left and much more about authoritarian versus non-authoritarian. The mild applause only, please, to the protocol. I will explicitly want to talk about that it's not that right and left are dissolved and that are not true, but I want to talk about the fight between right and left, and the reason that we're fighting this is because the right regards everything as left, so everything that is not them, not right. For them, Angela Merkel is an Antifa activist. And you're laughing, but that is how they look at the world. From their perspective, that's how that is. And if we, the other half of the society, take this fight, then we're being thrown into a battlefield that is dictated by the extremist right side. So I think we should start having a conversation, a fight about authoritarian versus non-authoritarian, because there's so many people who don't understand and would never regard themselves as left. And amongst that, so many liberal people who would lean up and stand up against authoritarian ideals. It should not be regarded as to be left when you're against right extremists. It's not left, it's democratic.
Versuch's nochmal. Schnell. Halt dich bereit. The longer you clap, the longer I will overdraw, I can tell you. So, in addition to this fight, we need a positive identification. We need, that's my view, the reenactment of, well, back in the days it was, it had a majority, that the new social question, that you are not allowed to ignore the success of the right and the extreme right, and we need a liberal approach to this. We need to offensively we need an old position that's called the offensive social liberalism. This is the lowest applause I've ever gotten for a proposal. So I mean this totally apart from the party lines. They mean that probably mean that you haven't applauded that much. I mean that not only in the parties, outside the parties, but you can also be within the parties openly social liberalists. If you, even in the CSU, if you have, if you can manage that split. There's a book by Jens Hacke, Existential Crisis of Democracy. He draws the crisis of liberalism between the two world wars. It was the
It was the realization by liberals in the Weimar Republic debate that democracy was only a representative and liberal democracy practiced, and that identitarian democratical concepts had to be necessary and had to have... I am not going to finish the translation because I don't want to misquote him here. You have to stress that before the liberal, there's a big, big, fat social. I'm obviously understand that I cannot convince convinced AfD voters, but I don't care about the people who are decided. I care about the diffused, the concretely unsatisfied, the people who have this feeling that something needs to happen now. For these, it might be enough that there's a feeling that there's a serious change happening, because otherwise they will lose their antibodies against the right. Nobody is pressured or forced by society to vote right, but societal neglect are the good feeding ground for the right. And right after the last election, I had a feeling of disturbedness. In today's show, there was the mayor of Dorf Chemnitz, where they got 47% for the AfD. And the answer to the question of this large number, he answered, Ask around who's got a good internet connection here, and you could think glass fiber optic against the right, but this is not what I want to stress here. What I want to stress here is the feeling of being neglected, of being disregarded. This is something that doesn't just work economically. Let's go back to Adorno and his central characteristics of the authoritarian. An offensive attitude can. Emmanuel Macron is an example where you could see how you can get potential Front National voters onto his side. His politics after the vote are a little bit different, and they deviate mildly from what he did beforehand. But his discourse beforehand showed at least a little bit of social liberalism. I would like to fill social liberalism with a little bit of content. I have nothing against conservatives. Some of my best enemies are conservatives. But to understand today's conservatism of today, you have to look at their figures of identification. Jens Spahn. Jens Spahn is the only living person that ever did not want to go to the German U, where in the German TV show with Anne Will we talked about retirement funds. My offensive understanding of social liberalism in the contrast towards conservatism starts with a praise for Spahn. I mean this in the utmost serious way. Yet Spahn, conservatism means, to be conservative means to take the speed of change and reduce them to a level where it's bearable. And of course after this there was a stark and there was a lot of critics about this. To be conservative means apparently something, to do something that the leftists would do, but only 10 years later. The Cicero author meant this as a joke, but yes, that's exactly the mechanism. I would not speak about 10 years, but more like 15 or 20, or rather a generation. But this is what the political oeuvre is done by the political conservatives to fight against, with every hair and fiber, against the new and the progress, up to the point where you've forgotten of why you're fighting, or to save the honor of the conservatives that I truly like. Or up until you find conservative phrases about things.
Until conservatives realized that you could also call it preserving God's creation. So Jens Spahn's definition of conservatism is progressive in slow motion, and that makes it bearable. Jens Spahn, in the fight against the authoritarian anti-democrats, an essential role, not just with his content, but also and especially by his sound. Because he serves the conservative reactionary desire for disrespectability. And there's always part of his conservatism, the willingness to look down on some people under certain circumstances. And you can also see it that sometime in between some conservatives have invented compassionate conservatism. It's like the alcohol-free beer of conservatism, robbed of one of its primary defining factors, and it didn't work. Jens Spahn as shown by his most discussed quotes, opens the CDU for people for whom Angela Merkel does not make people ridicule people enough. And that's why I built my praise of Spahn upon. The question for keeping Spahn propped up is, will he ever help to bring the AfD to power, either through coalition or direct collaboration? If the question can be answered with no, then Jens Spahn is, in spite of his Spahnness, good for Germany. Because he's taking this superiority about ridicule away from the AfD. If the question has to be answered with yes, then Spahn is a catastrophe. Of course, he's difficult. Since he's 22, all of us are paying him from the taxes we pay. And still, as Minister of Health and the health delegate for his
his politics are questionable. He was pointing out previously his attitude. It's, I mean, not as bad as Gerhard Schröder's bromance with Putin, but it was pretty sleazy. I'm not sure if the amount of double standard right politicians, conservative democracies.
And so this country especially needs conservative Democrats. Daniel Ziblatt published a book titled Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, wherein he shows that when in times of crisis in Europe, there's several criteria whether a democracy remains democratic, at least somewhat, or becomes authoritarian. The central criterion here is the conservative parties, and the question whether they succumb to the lures of the authoritative or whether they remain democratic. And following Ziblatt, then Spahn and the people like Spahn within the Union are the last bastions of conservatism against authoritarianism in this country. And in my opinion, also the fights between different conservative factions also weakens these forces. I mean, I'm not insulting Jens Spahn just for the fun of it. But this is not enough to describe the proposed social liberalism that I'm describing here. And so I created some key facets on these are just to be understood as offers. And a good part of the extreme right forces is stuck in a discussion, or stems from the discussion about the foreigners and multiculturalism, all of that. I've taken that into account. Even in case my first suggestion for an offensive social liberal focus is talking and talkativism as a political criterion, and I have to kind of cringe when I say this. This suggestion comes directly from the period of Enlightenment, putting facts into the center of political debate and not just our stomach's feeling. But it's also about the facts and the context. Let data be introduced into the discourse that contradicts our opinion. On the right, there's obviously a lot of them, but they're also existent in the liberal democracy. A continuous point of attack are the so-called
left living lies. And I understand this as a fighting word from the right that is built upon a certain amount of lies. But there's a little grain of truth in this, to this narrative of left lies. And this is why it's so strong and so powerful. And it seems to be the entry-level drug to the right side for non-political people. The topic of undisguised, what seems to be apparent are not left lies, but blind spots. Blind spots that you normally don't look at, where you don't really know that much, so you can't be guided by facts as much. And in the end of 2016, I published an article on Spiegel Online that did a bit of a dance on this, on the border of this. And the title to this article was, "Can Reality Be Racist?" I tried to describe a blind point like that, a blind spot. So I took something that's far away because that's easier to describe. So I took an example from Australia. There's a statistic that seems so unbelievable. In Australia, women in Aborigines households have a 34% higher chance of becoming the victim of domestic violence that compared to their white counterparts. So this violence is something that is considered as realistic, and the deciding thing and question is how do you deal with a problem like that in a non-racist way? I believe the non-racist, the non-right extremist civil society has not given a proper answer to this question. Applied to Germany, you can say that we as non-extremist right civil society have not found a way of dealing with Islam that is not racist. You can go directly, like, that are occupied and used as arguments for the right extreme side. There is a statistic in Northern Westphalia where 80% of petty theft is done by people from non-German background. And of course you have to put that into context. But you know how these discussions in social media work. When someone takes the official statistics about the 80% people of
Aber es sind nur 39,7%, wenn man die sozioökonomischen und demografischen Aspekte dieser Statistik berücksichtigt.
But it's only 39.7% if you take into account all these socioeconomic factors in the statistic. So the discussion of the liberal public seems to ignore these backgrounds. And that is why I think opens the door for right and extreme right forces against undecided people with too little defenses against the right. Because the offensive social liberal perspective is, if you need the correct statistic in order to not be racist, then you're doing it wrong. You're in the wrong way. As part of offensive social liberalism, you have to bear with data you don't like, but you don't have to deal with it in a racist way, because that's how you create these blind spots. And to make it even more obvious, I think it was absolutely right to take more than 1 million refugees into Germany, completely divorced from whether they are more or less criminal than Germans. And I think it will always remain the right thing, because humanity means helping the persecuted ones, even if they're problematic. And these blind spots of liberal and left streams in Germany become most obvious If we look at anti-Zionism, there is an anti-Semitism that has a Muslim background, and that is in addition to the already existing and still existing German anti-Semitism. And I think it's catastrophic to talk about or to deny one or the other, depending on how it fits your political agenda. The right and extreme right use the existing Muslim anti-Semitism as justification for their racist politics, without even acknowledging the anti-Semitism in their own ranks. But the answer of civil society cannot be to deny the existence of Muslim anti-Semitism, or the existence of leftist anti-Semitism, or the existence of hostility towards Israel that is colored with anti-Semitism. And that is another thing that means honesty in ethical social liberalism for me. Multiple leading figures of the SPD have called Mahmoud Abbas a good friend, a man that on Monday, April 30th, 2 days ago, in a speech explained that the Jews' social behavior was responsible for the Holocaust and not anti-Semitism. This is the essence of anti-Semitism, and it's not the first time that Abbas has acted this way. And if you keep calling this man a good friend, while at the same time condemning anti-Semitism, then it's more than a blind spot, then it's bigotry. And it's no coincidence that the book studies on the authoritarian character is about anti-Semitism. I think that with an offensive social liberalism, we need to call out exactly these points, that there are specific problems in specific cultures that we have to solve specifically and concretely. In the German culture, whatever that might be, as in certain cultures of a Muslim background. And not just by putting all these cultures into one racist bag together. And these cultural differences are also the reason why in the past few months there was so much talk about the leading culture. And here's my second very well-intended proposal. Fuck Leitkultur, love Leitwerte. So fuck the leading culture and instead go back to values instead. Many that are talking about Leitkultur as in culture don't mean culture but tradition, and tradition is just something you've gotten used to without looking back at values. It can quickly become exclusive because you can learn everything except for always having been with it. And it's this principle of measuring with different yardsticks. So one man sexually harassing women where it's okay because he looks a certain way, but a different man doing the same thing being measured with a different It is the direct understanding and the differentiation between black and white, them and us, and this shameful separation of two worlds because it means hierarchization. I understand that we have to have rules. We can't have our fundamental rights that will deal with everything. Because not everything that is okay is something that we should wish for. There's an example of tradition. There's a good example in Berlin. There's the tradition of the Charlottenburger. When you shut your one nose hole with the one side and snort out of the other. The Charlottenburger is not forbidden, and I am strictly against it to be forbidden, but at the same time, I would not like to live in a city where constantly everybody does a Charlottenburger. Only in situations where it's absolutely necessary, or maybe in Spandau. Leading values are more than the law.
it's about sharing a cultural sphere, but let's not dictate what should be eaten. I believe one of the solutions is multiculti. I don't believe this is the problem, but I believe it's the solution. When liberal, with a clear and offensive fundamental values, is what is going hand in hand with that. Angela Merkel claimed in 2010 was something that crashed and burned. And I would like to answer this with the utmost, strongest liberal response that I have. Let the people do let the people be, as long as they are within the values, within the democratic values that we've agreed upon. Outside of this framework, not anymore. No tolerance for intolerance. I would say, with quoting Rolf Sternberger, there is examples. Someone named Bad Sommer, the mayor of Mechelen in Belgium, he used to live in a problem town where he offensively introduced multiculti. And I would like to quote the German public radio. I'm sorry, he's going too quick for us to really.
So, quoting Deutschlandradio, around the turn of the century, a Mechelen in Flandern was known as the most dirty city, the population shrinking, crime in the streets, and today Mechelen is a shining example of successful integration. Streets have been rebuilt and patched up. Islamism is not a problem like in other parts of Belgium, and I almost don't want to say that he didn't only put his money on offensive multiculturalism, but also video surveillance. But I think that we can preserve basic rights using other means than tradition. And that goes both ways, also regarding integration. I believe that in Germany we have a double integration problem. The Germans are having a really hard time with integration and integrating others. And at the same time, there seems to be a row of cultures that do not seem to be able to be integrated very easily. To put some facts behind that, in Germany, people like to look down at the prejudiced Americans, half of which have voted for Trump. In the year 2016, when Trump was elected, the Pew Research Center has checked the diversity of ethnicities, so the mixture of cultures within a society. 58% of Americans think it makes the country a better place, but only 26% of Germans believe that. Whereas 31% of Germans feel that mixing ethnicities would make the country worse, whereas only 7% of Americans believe that. And I think we can see the consequences of that every day. Maybe not if you seem as white and German as most of the people here, but Germans from Turkish ethnic origin still treated as second-class citizen. They provably have a harder time finding apartments to rent, finding jobs, and they've lived here for generations. For the entire duration of a human life, this country has not managed to accept names like Yeshe or Murat as normal first names. And the reason for that is racism. And another reason is the acknowledgement and the predisposal for certain Muslim communities for authoritarianism. In Germany and Austria, it's become known that some mosques have practiced with children wearing uniform for Islamic war, and I think it's a huge issue that in some German mosques imams have been sent by military religious organizations that don't care about any sorts of values but just spread religious propaganda. And I think, of course, there's a reason to be worried. A strange irony of reality is that already in 2016, Syrian refugees made public that their German mosques are too conservative for them. The Arab-Israeli and psychologist Ahmad Massoud Ansur has identified 4 problematic areas in Muslim families in Germany: the equality of sexes, the understanding of secularity, freedom of speech, acceptance of other points of view, and the anti-Semitism. So the standard patterns of authoritarians that exist in exactly the same way in German authoritarian minds. And if you follow the social liberal approach, then you have to admit that the non-Muslim tile of the civil society left our allies, liberal Muslims, behind. Liberal Turkish Germans, Germans of Turkish origin, are under siege by Islamists, and the rest of society doesn't care. And this is the essence of my talk. The Muslims living in Germany are part of us. They are part of civil society. They are part of the us I was talking about earlier. And so I want the more authoritarian mindsets within the German Muslim community should be treated the same way as that in the German Christian community or whatever. In the third proposal, which is also the shortest, as we're approaching the goal, I want to become a little more digital. My third offensively liberal proposal is investing into a social Europe. Yesterday was Labor Day. And today, the budget plan of the German government has become public. They want to They don't want to give up their almost religious fervor for the black zero. And that means more than just not taking on new debt. This is the same kind of argument is also made for investing less. And that is exactly what's happening now. The coalition is investing less. For example, less in education, less in infrastructure. And in the worst possible, in the worst thinkable moment. If just for 1 minute we look at party politics, then Germany had a social liberal government once before, in the 1970s. The basic idea was very economically driven back then, and it can be reduced to the sentence, redistribution is good, but there has to be enough to distribute. And anyway, Germany tends to confuse economy and society, but I think this country can only remain prosperous and become social and liberal if the digitalization is successful. So everybody, all full-time employees just applauded at least. So, of course, this is putting in a very imprecise way a prosperous country, because the economic Germany is doing sensationally well, but the distribution of wealth is already defective. And digitalization, as much as I personally welcome it and find it inevitable, digitization threatens to further increase inequality here. I don't follow those that proclaim the impending end of work, where half the population is replaced by robots and artificial intelligence. I think that's a low complexity view because it looks at single jobs. So you think the one truck driver or the one logistics worker. So yes, maybe their job they're doing today might be replaced, and yes, some of the people in these jobs will only become software engineers in exceptional cases, but that's not news. 60 years ago, boilermen whose jobs have been automated away did not automatically become machine engineers. I think we're projecting a lot of basic problems of capitalism onto digitization, but that is guaranteed to lead us to insufficient solutions. I'm sorry for the very unfunny track in between. What is really one of the strongest arguments for social liberalism is through digitization. We don't threaten to remove work and reduce work, but well-paid work is getting less. And more work intelligence is migrating to the domain of machines, which is why the people around it can be employed cheaper, which increases social pressure, completely independent from record revenues in the economy or not. And in addition to that, the middle class is going down, and social mobility is decreasing. Germany is already one of the countries with the lowest social mobility within Europe, and here it's the hardest to get away from the legacy of one's parentage, even with the proper education. And it hasn't always been this way. Just in comparison, to give you a feeling, a West German professor of law in 1963 earned 45,000 Deutsche Marks per year. A new Volkswagen Beetle cost 4,200 Deutsche Marks. So in the economic boom, a professor of law earned one Volkswagen Beetle every 5 weeks. Today, the same people have issues even getting apartments close enough to university that they can actually pay for. And that kind of sums up the idea of education as the end-all, be-all solution for social issues. Middle-class families in the 20th century could buy a house in built-up in concentrated areas. Today they can't. And the social decline is one of the driving forces of populism. This is the bracket around it. The concept of Europe is tumbling, especially thanks to extreme right movements. And it seems that we just haven't understood what is at stake here. It's the social fabric of the entire continent. Somehow I feel like a firefighter that, looking at a burning house, is turning down the water, saying, well, there should still be enough left over for future fires. Maybe there has to be a sense for how infrastructure, the social state and politics go together in order to understand the consequences of this decision. But where would the coalition take this sense from? I don't want to only talk about the facts. I also want to talk about my interpretation of these facts. And this interpretation of the facts shows that more than ever, that we need a European policy, that offensive social liberalism has to be European, or it will not be at all. Germany profits so much from Europe, it's almost impossible to put that into statistics. Just the sheer value of peace seems to be ignored and underestimated regularly. But a social liberal Europe costs money, and a lot of money, because social liberalism means actively trying to remove inequity. And you can choose whether you want to first invest a lot or just spend a lot later, even more later. because that's the nature of investing right. It costs a lot up front, but it also has returns. It reduces costs down the line. It reduces the extremely expensive hidden costs of social inequities and injustices. The investing in the sense of social liberalism reduces the possibility in the future that this continent is going down the drain sometime. And I don't want it to go down the drain. I want Europe to not go down the drain because I believe this continent to be rather livable, especially when compared to the Antarctic. I don't want Europe to go down the drain. I want to fight for a social and free, non-racist Europe. Viva offensive social liberalism. Thank you for your attention.